Andres, thank you for being here, man. This is so great.
Thank you so much for the invite. Very much looking forward to talking about consciousness with you.
Yeah, me too, man. I'm excited. We've gone through a few rounds of rescheduling, and I'm happy that it's happening. Um, and okay, for starters, what is your job?
What is my job? Yeah, so I'm the CEO and director of research at the Qualia Research Institute, which is a tiny, tiny nonprofit based in the Bay Area that seeks to understand consciousness so that we can figure out innovative methods for reducing suffering and increasing the baseline of happiness, essentially. So I do a lot of things, but among them, participate in podcasts and outreach. But yeah, I work on academic papers, coding, research, providing feedback, writing blog posts, making videos. Yeah, that's what I do all day, pretty much.
No, it's awesome, and it's also an incredibly unique place. Like it's a very unique configuration of life that you figured out, and that there's something really cool about the fact that, of course, somebody who's deep into the hard problem of consciousness happens to be in a position where they're uniquely suited to explore these things. Okay,
Yeah,
why don't we start at we start up from where we're at? Why don't we start at the beginning? Why don't we continue at the beginning with what drew you to consciousness?
totally, totally. So, just checking that. Maybe it's my network. Okay, I think we're good. Um, okay, cool. So I was always a very curious kid about the nature of reality. Very obsessed with big questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? What is the meaning of life? What happens after you die? And things like that. And for most of my childhood, I actually believed that physics and math would answer those questions if we were just to pursue them to the very end. So I was very determined to be a physicist, a mathematician as a kid. Uh, Participated in like math Olympiads. I was very driven in that front. But then at the age of 16, I actually had like ego death experience on marijuana, which is kind of rare for that substance. It only happened once, and it's never happened again. It was just one weird reaction. Maybe it was a
Hmm.
strange batch or something. I don't know, but it was it was the very classical type of Hindu like merging with with the ocean kind of, yeah, actually the
Hmm.
drop returning to the ocean type experience,
Hmm.
kind of like feeling that I'm the ocean of consciousness and I'm inside my body but also outside and we're all part of the same ocean. And now that the experience changed my life, not because I believed in it. I mean, I think like that is a very common thing. People take at face value, like a mystical
Hmm.
experience like that. It's like, oh, like that is the truth, and this is the illusion, or
Hmm.
something like that. They might say. But for me, it was much more of a opening of the possibility for different views of identity being reasonable. Like I just had never deeply considered the idea of like, hey, maybe we are all one on something like I
Hmm.
really all my life up to that point, it really had felt that I am me and you're you, and we are just fundamentally separate and like in our own streams, and we're never gonna really, really actually know each other. Like there was a sense of separation like that, and after that experience, I realized like no, actually, that is just one of many possibilities, and more so that like the thing that makes it impossible for us to know one way or the other is we just don't have a good understanding of consciousness. So it kind of like that sparked um, a whole trajectory of trying to come up with like very rigorous philosophical arguments for different views on consciousness and on personal identity. And I decided, I'm just going to dedicate myself to this. Is the most important thing possible. I only applied to colleges that had a cognitive science degree, or in the case of our alma mater, the case of symbolic systems, is like, okay, yeah, this actually fits the bill. Like, this is, there's a good chance that this can advance the our understanding about consciousness. Uh, so yeah, I mean, ever since, like, that is when I was 16 years old, and I have, not changed my mind about consciousness being the most important topic since then. Um, but my views on consciousness have evolved enormously. I mean, like, I really started kind of like a lone thinker there, like just coming up with thoughts on myself. Um, After the mystical experience, I read the classics, like, David Chalmers and Daniel Dennett, and started to form opinions and beliefs. And for a while, I very much really was kind of like a traditional functionalist. Like,
Hmm.
Hilary Putnam was the philosopher who kind of like coined that term and developed it philosophically, but
Hmm.
it's just a very widespread, very common. It's kind of like the typical educated perspective on consciousness, which is
Hmm.
that um, it's the emergent effect of the right kind of information processing happening in the brain.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I was convinced of that for a long time, and of its implications as well. Like, I delved into transhumanism. I delved into kind of like the whole Kurzweil perspective on how to build a mind and things like that. And so, for example, I was convinced that, yeah, I mean, we will all do mind uploading in the future.
Hmm.
We will create AIs, and they will be sentient, and hopefully they will have
Hmm.
rights, and like the future of
Hmm.
of life is probably artificial. And I just had like a lot of views like that, which are very common in again, like, educated circles in these
Hmm.
spaces. um but then it was like talking to David Pearce, who is a pretty influential British philosopher in the transhumanist
Hmm.
space, um, who actually convinced me that science and most thinkers actually don't know about what's called phenomenal binding. That is the question of how
The hard problem.
it's one facet of the hard problem, I would
Mm.
say. So the hard problem, Chalmers summarized it as,
Hmm.
how can you get qualia, how can you get feelings and experience out of form and structure? If
Hmm.
reality is made of just form and structure, how do you get something qualitative like consciousness out of that?
Hmm.
um, the binding problem is more specific. Is more about, like, how is it possible that a spatially distributed system can simultaneously contribute to a unified experience? um,
Right, right, right.
yeah.
So the concert between the reductionist parts. What is the extra sum that yields the phenomenological experience? Which I think is like maybe worth getting into, like the hard problem a little bit. Add a little bit more color, because the way, like, to put it in the context of human thinking, right? Like, we had adopted this very empirical, descriptive, reductive approach to science and determining, what truths, how to represent truth. And so, a house may be on fire and there's a person in the house, and you could describe that with math. You could describe the chemistry of the combustion, and you can describe the, hormones running through the person's brain, but you can't, from no matter how you represent it, or at least we don't know how yet, get the feeling of being stuck inside a burning house, right? And so there's another framing of the hard problem that I really like, that is, how does the water of physical mechanics turn into the wine of subjective experience, right?
Yes.
And so it adds a bit more poetic flair to it. But and so what you're saying is that the binding problem is a part of that problem. That is, what is the mapping, the connection between the parts and the thing that experiences the whole.
Yeah.
So I think of, like, all the stuff that's going on in my body, like, the organs are doing their things, glands are secreting their hormones, but even wilder, each eye is a separate thing, but I get one cohesive image. Like I get one cohesive experiential self. Like I'm feeling all of it at the same time. And how does that happen if the distributed parts are that okay? Maybe that's where we can continue.
No, exactly. I mean, it is a topic that my experience is most people have not thought about it, and
Mm.
so it just kind of like out of left field is a blind spot, right? So,
Yeah.
but the moment you get into it, you start to realize actually how intricate and complex the problem is, because
Mm.
um, there is various types of binding. For example, there is how different color sensations put together with objects in our visual field. Like
Mm.
how do we
Mm-hmm.
actually assign colors to objects, um, and how do we prevent the color from kind of like bleeding out of the object?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Even
Error
though,
correcting. Yeah.
yeah, because our eyes are not don't have actually the level of resolution that would enforce those boundaries properly. That's like top down processing that happens
Mm-hmm.
afterwards, um, keeping the colors inside boundaries, and that's one type. But then there's also like another one, which is like, okay, how are the objects put together as part of a scene, and
Mm-hmm.
then how do you,
The
how are
scene. Yeah.
how is the scene put together with their tactile sensations and auditory sensations, and then how all of that is put together in like a snapshot of experience. And
Mm-hmm.
you need some kind of detailed data structure that can account for all of these part whole relationships.
Mm.
um, it's a pretty complex thing, and there's a lot of counterexamples to kind of like any kind of like simple data structure that
Mm.
one might postulate. um, but it's also something that, in principle, if you think of the brain as a collection of atoms and forces interacting, there doesn't seem to be a principled way to be able to say,
Mm.
okay, these patterns over here are connected to these patterns over here to form part of the same experience. um, so you really have to kind of actually come up with a different ontology for what is going on. It's one of kind
Mm.
of like the big insights, I think, that comes from thinking deeply about the binding problem, is to realize that an ontology of atoms and forces simply won't get you there. Um,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah, and
thanks.
there's
Yeah, go
nowhere.
ahead.
I mean, like like it's in a different space altogether, right? Like there's. It's also very hard. Like you can. It's this is like an Annie in the black and white room type of argument where there's an old argument that says that a person may live in a black and white room and in that room there's a library that contains all the information in the world and you can describe everything with all the equations and all uh, you can know everything like book smarts, but as soon as she leaves and encounters an apple, uh, all of a sudden she experiences the color red. And there's something that is different about the definition of the color red, which we can pretty accurately say is like this bandwidth of light or this frequency of light, which even just saying that isn't red. Like red
Yeah.
is just the feeling of red, or pain is just the feeling of pain. And so then but then and then when you try and crawl into that space of the feeling of things of the qualia, which is exactly what you're talking about. I mean, the objective language, the sort of like it starts to grasp at something it can't really hold, and that's where it
Yes.
gets really tricky too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And for example, yeah, I mean, it is indeed like a lot of people do think of something like, oh, red fundamentally has to do with this frequency of light.
Hmm.
Um, but there's like a twist to that, which is actually we don't map frequencies of light to colors. We map the spectral power distributions to colors, which is like the whole,
Hmm. Right.
the whole range of all of the frequencies that you're getting get mapped onto a color. And actually, there you may not even have the frequency red, as long as the rest of the distribution still triggers the same cells activations in the eye. So it's not even a
Right.
frequency of light. And on top of that, you could actually be blind. You could have like
Hmm.
problems with your eyes, but have synesthesia, so that when you
Hmm.
listen to the right music, you experience the color red in in your visual field. So this just shows that you can really dissociate the
Mm-hmm.
input
Mm-hmm.
from the experience
The
that the input
Qualia.
triggers, the qualia. Yeah. Um, so what I study, yeah, it's is the structure of the qualia itself, quite independently in a way from the input. I mean, of course, we use inputs to study it, but
Mm-hmm.
um, the inputs are just the trigger. Actually, you can
Mm-hmm.
study qualia with very different triggers, no problem. Um, and yeah, I mean, yeah, the binding problem, I guess, to get back a little bit to the progression of story. Yeah, like it is one thing that David Pierce just kind of like really pushed on and saying like, hey, are you sure you have a good theory of binding? And everything that I would come up with, like, he would find a way to refute it or explain what the problem with it was. And I kind of had a breakdown there, in the sense of like, okay, all of my models about consciousness actually were misguided because they were not taking into account binding. And on top of that, that seems to be the case for everybody I know. So there's this big gaping hole, a gaping hole on people's theories of consciousness. Even among professors and philosophers, just is like, no, there's some kind of like neglect about like this sub
Mm-hmm.
problem. And that's really kind of like what made me feel there was, in some sense, a somewhat of an arbitrage opportunity here. Is like, okay, if there is a research group that takes binding seriously, they might be able to make a lot more progress than others, simply because they're paying attention to something that nobody else is. And
Mm-hmm.
that was one big piece of it. The other big piece was, uh, with my collaboration with my co-founder, Michael Johnson, which was his insight that the structure of experience seems to be what determines how good or bad it feels, as opposed to something semantic, like, oh, you're achieving your goals, or something physiological, like you have dopamine in your brain or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
um, it was realizing like, hey, like, actually the main thing that drives pleasant versus unpleasant qualities has to do with consonance, dissonance, has to do with
Mm-hmm.
whether you're feeling is tense versus soft and
Mm-hmm.
smooth, and features like that. And he has this theory called the symmetry theory of valence, which is that he thinks that the more symmetrical the phenomenology is, the more pleasant an experience is. um, and I was very agnostic about it. It's like, hey, that may or may not be true, but it's a very new way of thinking about this. And I think
Mm-hmm.
those two things together
Mm-hmm.
is like, hey, this new approach to valence plus phenomenal binding as being very essential, and also a desire to really figure out how to reduce suffering on a large scale.
Mm-hmm.
And those things put together is like, okay, actually, I think we have an opportunity to contribute something really new.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like what propelled me to co-found the
Mm-hmm.
organization. We started kind of like collaborating in 2015, but officially made it an organization in 2018, and then
Mm-hmm.
uh, yeah, the rest is history.
That is awesome. Okay, can I unpack something with you? You said the
Yeah,
structure of experience.
yeah,
Structure in what space? And you said symmetry too. Like in what space is that in?
yeah. So
So.
the structure of experience. So this goes again along the lines of thinking of what kind of nesting structure there is for the objects of your experience, the phenomenal objects. So a phenomenal object is the object as it presents itself to you, as opposed to the
Mhm.
object out there in the world,
As
right?
such, yeah.
As such, exactly. Um, and as we were discussing, like, color is attached to particular shapes, and then shapes are attached to objects, and then objects
Mm,
are attached and positioned within scenes. um,
mm,
the same, you can do a similar analysis with like the structure of sound. Like, yeah, there are pure tones, but they're spatially and temporally located, and they have tones usually come with an intrinsic notion of space, having to do with the
mm.
reverb with which you're
Mhm, mhm,
representing them. And the same with tactile feelings. So you can do kind of these like structural analysis of how each field of experience
mhm,
is structured, and how those structures are correlated across fields to create multimodal percepts. That is what I mean by the structure of an
mm,
experience.
mhm,
and and it's much more variable than we realize. I mean, like,
Mm.
if all you ever have access is kind of like to normal everyday state of consciousness, it's actually quite easy to confuse the structure of your own experience with the structure of the world, because
Mm-hmm.
there's a very adaptive mapping. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
most people may not even realize, right, they're actually interacting with a world simulation. they
Mm-hmm.
their world simulation is accurate enough that they actually think they're interacting with the world directly, right? And
Mm-hmm.
we evolved that illusion. But if you seriously explore meditation, or seriously explore psychedelics, or various exotic states of consciousness, or even visual illusions, and various like sensory illusions,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you come to realize, hey, the possible structures of a moment of experience spans a much, much, much larger space. Where, I mean, to give you some strange examples, like pretty out there examples, like on DMT, there's a good reason to believe that the structure of the space, the phenomenal space that you inhabit, can actually change geometry. And you can experience a universe where the geometry is hyperbolic as opposed to Euclidean. So, I mean, that's a
Hmm.
very radical change to
Oh
the
yeah.
structure of experience. Yeah. um, and then also, for example, in Jhana meditation, which are these very pleasant,
Mm-hmm.
high concentration states, which I'd be happy to talk more about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the experience becomes simpler and simpler and simpler until it is just a completely empty field of space. And
Mm.
then it becomes just a pure empty field of awareness, for example.
Mm.
And usually that, when you get to those levels where it's just, let's say, a field of awareness, usually that feels very nice and rich
Mm.
and
Mm.
delicious and rejuvenating, even though there's nothing happening, even though it's so
Hmm.
empty otherwise. But for me, that's a big hint. I mean, that is a case where the structure of your experience, the fact that it's so empty and smooth, has this very obvious, clear, direct effect on how good it feels. And in general, it
Hmm.
feels very good when you're in that state, or at least it feels there's no problem, there's no struggle.
Hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
whereas, I mean, actually, typically a DMT state tends to be full of struggle and full of complexity and full
Mm-hmm.
of discomfort in all sorts of different ways. And then, yeah, if you zoom in into the discomfort usually has something to do with two things are trying to inhabit the same space at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, and there's like a
Mm-hmm.
conflict there, um, and that you can think of it as a type of dissonance, or
Mm-hmm.
or irregular pressure in the field.
Mm-hmm.
And
Or
I would argue, yeah.
errors, like yeah.
Hmm.
You're never, you're building a model of reality, and like you're building the structure, and you have sort of things that build on top of each other. The car is red. That's one way of looking at it. You could also say the collection of red is the car. And so you're building out this model, but the when you have this dimensionality threshold, and you have two things that are, it's either top or down, it is either left or right, it is either one or the other, and you have to choose like the dimension that you fall into. That's where, like, in the choosing of those dimensions, that's where the tension appears. And
Hmm.
that's a beautiful idea. That's an incredibly cool idea, because it also gives you this intuition for not all uh, not all of them are the same, right? Like something more foundational can be a lot more tense.
Yeah.
Am I a good person or am I a bad person is a much bigger
Ah.
like, tension thing than like, is the car red or is the car blue? You know,
That's right. That's right. Did I pick the wrong religion? Yeah.
that kind of stuff. Like, am I doing the right thing with my life?
Yeah.
Like those the big ones. Like,
Yep.
um, or the fear of being incorrect, maybe something there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and in general, let me put it this way: we inhabit a state of consciousness typically where errors feel bad,
Mm,
and that is for good evolutionary reasons. Um, but I think errors. I mean, errors are always going to be relative, like relative to a
Hmm.
goal or relative to a purpose. Otherwise, well, there's nothing can be an error if you don't have a particular goal. Um, so it's not like errors inherently feel bad. It's more that we are we set up our mind in such a way that errors trigger dissonance, and I actually think it's like
Hmm.
the dissonance, the thing that is low level unpleasant. And I mean, let me put it this way: you can make lots of errors, but if you don't care about it, there's no
Hmm.
problem. It's more kind of like when you do care about an error, usually that's going to be it's going to trigger a sense of dissonance, and then that's the unpleasant component. You can also have a lot of dissonance with no errors. I mean, sometimes you can have like just some
Hmm.
bad physiological attractor where, well,
Hmm.
yeah, the cardiovascular system is in this weird state, is not synced up, and it's just anxiety producing, and but there's no proximal cause for it. It's just a
Hmm.
malfunction of the system, and that can feel quite bad. But yeah, so meaning that it's in the details of the structure of the experience, so whether you're going to find pleasure or discomfort or both at once.
Hmm. No, that's just the idea of trying to map Qualia is fascinating. You mentioned another thing that you'd also mentioned the couple of times that we've interacted before. This concept of an attractor, which I don't think many people are familiar with as a thing in the world. Would you mind giving a sense of like the explanation of an attractor, how you might have a physiological attractor, and then we can get into how you get some like cognitive or like thought attractors and how they may be connected.
Yeah, yeah. So attractors are. Mm, yeah, I'm thinking how to explain it, because there's some fairly technical definitions, and there's like some things that might require them, but I think it can be made pretty intuitive. And like, I think just keeping it very intuitive is this idea that
Hmm.
when you have like a very complex system, lots of different variables,
Hmm.
there are some configurations that when you're in one of them, uh,
Hmm.
you will continue to be in them. um,
Yeah.
and eh, and I think orbital dynamics is a very good example, that like you
Hmm.
could have like, you have like the famous three body problem. It's there's very, very hard to predict how three bodies are going to interact, especially in 3D. You get these
Hmm.
crazy
Hmm.
orbits, and usually it spirals out, or like two of them collapse into one, and one just goes away. But there are some stable orbits that use all three bodies. For example, it's kind
Hmm.
of like a figure eight one, where like they're
Hmm.
constantly moving. That would be a stable attractor, because if you're there, tiny, well, maybe not that one, but there are many of these where like tiny perturbations are fine, because it's
Hmm.
self-correcting. Like if it starts deviating a little bit, it's okay, because it's gonna get back to the
Hmm.
main attractor. And then there's unstable attractors where like any tiny deviation will just like completely take you out of it. Um,
Hmm.
and then there is what's called, yeah, strange attractors, which is when you're not doing a simple repetitive motion, but maybe you're toggling between a couple different motions, but
Hmm.
as a whole, you're still trapped between those few states.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, when I say, like, let's say a physiological attractor, it would be a state that is self-reinforcing. For example, um,
Hmm.
if you have anxiety for no reason, and then you ask yourself, like, why do I have anxiety?
Hmm.
There doesn't seem to be a reason. And thinking, oh, there doesn't seem to be a reason, if that causes you anxiety, then that whole thing is
Hmm.
going to be feeding back on itself.
Oh yeah.
Just as an example. Or on the flip side, right, is like if you're deeply relaxed for no reason, like in a jhanic state, meditation state, is like you ask yourself, like, why am I so relaxed? Oh, there's no reason for it. It's like, oh, that's nice, that's peaceful,
Hmm.
and that that keeps you further relaxed, right? So those would be
Hmm.
very simple examples of like attractors in physiology and in mind space.
No, that makes total sense, and it's an incredibly powerful concept. I think like, and it shows up everywhere. There's, uh, you know, if you're in a rut and you're sort of like thinking the same loops over again, and you're like, something triggers you, and you go down the same path over and over and over again. Um, I struggled with fast food for a very long time. So it'd be this thing where it would be like, I don't feel adequate. I need to escape. I'm gonna eat fast food, and then like I would reflect on that. I was like, that's not great. I don't feel adequate. I'm gonna eat fast food, and that's an attractor, And I think like
Yeah.
it starts with who knows at what level it begins. At the thought level, at the hormonal level, at the physiological level, at something deeper, something who knows where genetics. Like there might be some genetic attractors um, and and they show up, everywhere. It like everywhere in society. You see game theoretic attractors. Like I won't if you won't, or things like that, where like they're self reinforcing. Um, and then there's this idea that like I think is like really cool, that is like in a very abstract form. Like we're thinking thoughts, and the thoughts, we don't know where the thoughts really are, but we know that thoughts have a sequence, and they can loop back on each other. And so whatever thing you're doing when you're thinking, might lead you to an attractor state where like you go on a I go thought A, thought B, thought C, thought A, and then I'm back to it, and then I'm back to it, and then I'm back to it. And the relationship between the body and the mind there is who knows, but I think it's just a beautiful concept worth highlighting. um, okay, and how does that relate to states of consciousness? Because I think that's sort of like we're all running this program, we can't escape the program. But so it's basically like, what attractor state are we in?
Yeah.
And so how does that mapping work in your view?
Yeah. That actually, I think it might be worth mentioning. Yeah, actually, my master's thesis also
Mm,
related to symbolic systems, because the I analyzed a data set from a social network called the Experience Project, which was unfortunately it's shut down. I think it wasn't profitable after some years,
mhm,
but it was a very nice social network that was focused on shared experiences. Kind of like it's kind of like
mm,
there were like groups around experiences. Like I don't know, Star Wars, like just very
mhm,
basic things, but then also very specialized things like I don't know, very specific hobbies. I love making
mhm,
sushi of this type or whatever.
mm,
Um, but one feature it had was mood updates. So you would log in, and it would prompt you, "How are you feeling today?" Uh, you select from a drop down of 175 emotions. Um, yeah, not a great user interface, but it was interesting. You select also how intense you feel that, and
mm,
then you explain the cause of it. It's like,
mm,
I feel sad because my mother forgot my birthday or whatever. So that database was actually a gold mine for like sentiment analysis, right? Because you could
mm,
train a data set for, or using it as a training data
mm,
set for a machine learning algorithm to predict the emotion for a given text. That was
mhm,
very useful, very cool. But then on top of that, it was also a fantastic data set for studying the dynamics of emotions, because
mm,
you could see, crunching all the data, you could say, given this emotion, what is the probability that you
mm,
will be in another emotion afterwards, right? And
mm.
you could even do kind of like what's called a
Sequence, yeah, like a.
exactly like what, like the very popular models back in the day, 10 years ago, like hidden Markov models, where like you take a
Mm-hmm,
sequence of these emotions and you try to predict the next one.
mm-hmm,
So I did a bunch of work in that space, like just modeling these emotional transitions. And actually I found there were like emotional attractors. I mean, like there were
mm,
clusters of emotions that if you happen to be in any one of them, you're much more likely to stay in that cluster,
mm,
than to move to a different cluster. And I actually found like five of these clusters, and I think of them as emotional attractors.
mm-hmm,
These are kind of like, there was just a broadly very positive cluster, like from feeling
mm-hmm.
elated
It
to
feels good,
blissful,
yeah.
and yeah, just all the good stuff. There was a uh, angry, anxious cluster,
Mm,
kind of like very irritated and like
mm,
kind of fed up and angry. then there was a depression afraid
Mm.
cluster, where like the deepest of that and like the most predictive of staying there for a long while was this emotion called doomed. If you feel doomed,
Mm.
that's not
Mm.
good. That's
No,
not
no,
good.
no, no, no. Oof.
um, um,
Pretty dismal.
yep. Uh, then there was, oh well, yeah, I guess I'm talking about the six ones, but yeah, usually the negative ones would cluster, but yeah, essentially breaking out into six. Then you have like the funny attractor,
Hmm.
which is like kind of like humorous, lighthearted. I mean, it's not like profound happiness, but it is
Hmm.
like
Yeah, simple
cheerful.
things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, and then you had kind of the bored, like blah, kind of like anhedonic, like you don't
Mm-hmm.
feel much of anything, and you feel kind of like tired all the time,
Hmm.
um, and so
Lethargic.
once, yeah, kind of lethargic, exactly. Once I found these attractors, then I could do really interesting things like analyze uh, what emotions predict switching between attractors, for example. So
Mm, mm,
that's something we called gateway emotions that like take you from
mm,
one to the other. For example, feeling hopeful, like
mm-hmm,
hopefulness as an emotion, is a very good predictor of you wearing a bad attractor and you moving towards one of the good ones.
mm,
And I'm pretty sure it's not just that, oh, the circumstances are improving and therefore you're actually going to be in a better life state. I'm pretty sure that the emotion itself of hopefulness has an actual causal
mm,
effect on your system that is
mm-hmm.
generally pretty positive. And yeah, something that can be investigated with meditation, like really bumping up like the feeling of hopefulness and just seeing how that affects you. And usually, yeah, it can can kick you out of a depression if it's, a high enough dose of hopefulness. um, and yeah, things like that. And so I think, yeah, the lens of attractors is quite useful for emotions and mind states.
That's such a cool. I think that's the perfect way to describe them, and I think like the direct applicability of those findings is insane, right? Like this is something that you can just be aware of, and and then it might take a bit of knowledge to know when your brain is trying to hijack, your interpretation of a given emotion. But in terms of wanting to feel better and wanting to, which is a whole even thing. I mean, like therapeutic benefits of this stuff is I think is just huge. Like even getting to the point where you decide that you deserve to feel better is sometimes a challenge, and but
Hmm.
having a map like that, is incredibly cool. Okay, so then how do you study the nature of consciousness? How do you study the structure of experience? What's the methodology there?
Yeah, yeah. It's a big topic. Uh, so the answer is going to be a little bit multifaceted.
Let's do
um,
it.
yeah. So I mean, early on at QRI, we realized that we needed what we called a full stack approach, which is we look at the problem from many angles at once. Precisely because, hey, a theory of consciousness requires you to answer many detailed questions, including the binding problem. But there's other ones. For example, the palette problem, which has to do with what is the set of all qualia values, qualia
Oh my
varieties,
gosh, yeah.
how are they related? Yeah. You also have the causal efficacy problem, which is how consciousness is causally useful, and explaining and
Hmm.
articulating that. um, and so what we call a full stack approach is one that look at the following three layers. So we look at philosophy of mind, actually
Hmm.
answering these questions. We write papers for philosophy
Hmm.
journals, try to advance in that front. Then we think that with better philosophy of mind, and that's a very high bar. It's very, I would say, it's very arrogant of me to say we can make contributions to philosophy of mind, because it's a a lot of people
Hmm.
try, obviously, right? But I'm determined. So we think better philosophy of mind can lead to better neuroscience, because if you have a better
Hmm.
understanding of what consciousness is and its role, then you can be better at determining what studies are worth conducting and in what way and what to look for in neuroimaging data sets. So
Hmm.
so we also have like neuroscience research that is informed by our philosophy of mind,
Hmm.
and then we all ultimately this cashes out in the development of neurotechnology. which is,
Hmm.
if you have better neuroscience, in principle, you should be able to create like better neurotechnology because you understand at a deeper level what is the mechanism of action, what is the thing that you're tackling, and
Hmm.
what kind of effect you might anticipate. So our full stack approach is those three levels. We focus on
Hmm.
all those threes, um, and so these might involve creating like new tools for quantifying subjective experience, new ways of analyzing data sets, whether it's inputs like sound or images, and also analyzing things like EEG and fMRI with
Hmm.
new lenses. Um, and then also developing various kinds of technology. Like one thing that we spent a lot of time in 2021, we have a video about this. We're also going to publish a write-up about it pretty soon. It's how to use like vibration to
Hmm.
interface with your consciousness. Yeah,
Ooh.
yeah.
Okay. I'm into this stuff. Uh, I mean, just the concept of vibration, I think, is just like one of the uh, fundamental things in the our understanding of reality. Let's get into that. I mean, like let's explore like what that was about.
Yeah, totally. So there is this beautiful piece of technology called a sub pack, which is kind of like a backpack that has
Hmm.
two actuator, two vibrators.
Oh, like a Wooger. I get ads for
Yes,
it all the time. Yeah,
exactly. Yes, I mean, and to be honest, I have not explored the Woozer.
yeah.
I bet you could do very similar things. If I remember correctly, though, the Woozer was kind of like more localized. It's kind of like a few patches.
I forget. Yeah, I forget. It's like a
Yeah,
vest.
whereas yeah, the the sub pack is more kind of like a whole, like there's a whole surface area and it all kind of vibrates in synchrony.
Mm. Mm.
Um, but so the beautiful thing about that piece of technology is that it can render any waveform you give it into vibration.
Mm.
So it's not like, I mean, because there's like a lot of massage chairs, there's a lot of
Mm. Mm.
like massage, for feet and hands and things like that. But usually what you will have is a few kind of like presets. It's kind of like, oh, you can put the 40 hertz preset program or something, right?
Sure,
or
sure, sure, sure.
or there might be something of the relaxing program or something like that. What is beautiful about the sub pack is that you can put in any piece of music you want and it will try to render
Oh
it.
my gosh.
Yeah, it's an arbitrary
I'm thinking of
waveform.
playing the synth, like playing
Yeah,
synths and like playing with that and like seeing chords and oh
yeah.
my gosh, that's so cool.
that's for example, yeah, I spent like many hours like with two sub packs, like one in front and one
Mm.
in back, connected to my computer with a keyboard, connect with a MIDI keyboard connected also to my computer, and using Ableton Live to do
Mm-hmm.
like sound crafting, and I would essentially, yeah, like be playing like very bass sounds, and like it would just translate instantly into body vibration, and this whole, it's a very fast
Oh
iterative
my god.
loop for like finding, hey, what type of vibrations actually interface with the body well. um, and we found a lot of things. I mean, like we found that just as with music, there is, a kind of like, there is a music theory, right? There's a
Mm-hmm.
ways of anticipating what chords are going to sound happy, what chords are going to sound sad. um, the same happens with vibration. Like there is a music theory of
Mm.
vibration. We have only scratched the surface, and I'm sure it's going to be a big deal as we advance. But there is such a thing as pleasant vibrations. There's such a thing as unpleasant vibrations, and there's mathematics that explain that the difference.
Oh, that is so cool. And how? I mean, I have so many questions. I mean, I want to dive into this, but could you use music theory as a standing platform to then like explore the vibrational space? Because I'm
It's
guessing
yeah,
like very intuitively, like music exists in a domain with two degrees of freedom. There's like frequency and amplitude and time, maybe sure, but you
yeah,
can't have frequency without time anyway. And two ears, right? So like there's two ears, and your brain is parsing that into pleasant or unpleasant sounds, But with vibration, it's every skin cell, and there's temperature, humidity. There's like all these other tactile things, and
Yeah.
the perturbations of them, right? Because like
Yes.
the sound may move, like if the speed goes up, the temperature goes up, and like all these types of like things that appear. So the space is, I can't even imagine how big the space is. But I wonder if music theory can help like be the initial flashlight into that stuff. And it gets me
Yeah.
actually like this is a tangent. I don't want to lose the main thread, but how does the vibration map to the wave? Like what is the function um, on like let's say like a 2D thing, like a 2D square? What is the actuation of that square with a wave that comes in?
Yeah, it is. It is quite literally any sound that you give it between 10 and 200 hertz, it will
Sure.
essentially just mechanically render it. I mean, like a
Uh-huh.
speaker, essentially.
Oh, sure. Like it'll just propagate the wave into the surface.
Yes, yes. It it
Got it.
it doesn't go above 200 hertz. Like it, like at some point,
Uh-huh,
is
sure.
it just doesn't even try. And also I think like below 10 hertz it just doesn't work, so there's like kind of that
Sure.
window, and that window is, yeah, it's going to correspond to kind of like the base of the music. uh
Mm-hmm.
I mean, something that we used to do, for example, too, is it was like frequency shift a song several
Mm.
octaves, so that like we could then also play that in the subpack, and so it
Mm.
would render some of the higher melodies as well, and not just
Mm.
the bass
Mm-hmm.
of the music. um but yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, a lot of music theory principles hold. For example, when you put two frequencies that are close together, if they're too close together, you get this effect that is kind of this roughness effect,
Mm. Mm.
where where you get a kind of like these beat patterns from two. Like if you have like 100 hertz and 105 hertz, that's
Mm-hmm.
not a good combination, because
No, no,
it
no,
creates
yeah.
these very wildly oscillating beat patterns, and that has a certain feel that is kind of anxiety producing. Um,
Mm.
Whereas, yeah, if you combine like 50 plus 100 plus 150, this harmonic progression, usually that's going to have a more pleasant, calming type of effect. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Meaning harmony and dissonance really matter in body vibration,
Mm.
just as they do in sound. But there are some notable differences. A key difference is like how easily we get bored with patterns. So
Mm.
in music, how we think of it is as at QRI, like our model of art. We have
Mm.
we published an essay on art, uh, on called Harmonic Society. If people are curious,
Mm.
you can Google it. um,
Yeah, I'll put a link to it.
yeah. Harmonic Society at QRI. So um, in that theory, boredom is a very key thing that art is always trying to somehow minimize or override or walk around. And the things like with sounds, we get bored very easily. So like if you repeat the
Mm.
same chorus
Ooh.
too many times, or the same note too many times, even if it's a pleasant note, something in your being recognizes that you're not learning anything, and it makes you a little bit desperate. It makes you a little bit um kind of unsettled when you're like there for too long. um we found that with body vibration, the the time it takes for boredom to kick in is way longer, so you can actually play very
Mm.
simple, very consonant, kind of like soothing vibrations, and it's gonna take like a solid 15 minutes before you say like enough, I'm tired of this.
Hmm.
Whereas if you were to play the same with audio, it really would take only 1 or 2 minutes before you say like,
Hmm.
yeah, this is too much, I don't want this anymore. um, Meaning that you could actually get away with much more a much more repetitive track when it comes to
Hmm.
body vibration, and in fact, some aspect of you actually thanks you for it. It's kind of like,
Hmm.
oh, okay, this gives me a little bit of kind of like a scaffold to organize myself around, and there's a some goodness to actually like repetition in body vibration,
Mm,
with one big caveat, which is there are some potential crazy side effects if you experience too much repetition. So
mm,
uh, for example, early on, one of the things we were very curious about is like understanding the therapeutic potential of 40 hertz. In the
mm,
literature, you will see a lot of people talking about like, oh, 40 hertz is the panacea, like 40 hertz
mm,
lights or 40 hertz
mm,
sounds. They use it for Alzheimer's in rats, for example. Like
mm,
40 hertz like audio seems to reduce amyloid plaque and crazy things like that. And so we thought like, okay, maybe there's something to this 40 hertz thing in body vibration. And I did this experiment of literally experiencing 40 hertz um, every day for 20 minutes as just an experiment, just see what would happen. And the problem was, after 2 weeks of doing this, I started to have uncontrollable sleep paralysis, where when I
oh
would go to
no,
yeah, when I would go to sleep,
oh
I
my
would
god.
end up in this like twilight state, and my whole body will be vibrating at 40 hertz, and it was very unpleasant, and I was like stuck in there for the duration
Mm.
of the sleep paralysis,
Of
and it
whatever
was,
cycle you, was it tracked with like the cycle that you usually did?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
And
Oh gosh, that's a nightmare.
yeah, so your body learns the vibrations you give it to it,
Mm.
and eventually it figures out how to reproduce them. So after that experience, I realized like, actually I do need to have some kind of like vibration hygiene, if you will. Like you've got to be mindful of the vibrations you put into your body, because eventually your body learns them, and starts replicating them during sleep. Um and in the end, I concluded that 40 hertz might be good if you are highly dysregulated, like if you're like really
Mm,
sick,
mhm,
and you have so much anxiety, there's no stable pattern or attractor in your
yeah.
body, then 40 hertz is gonna be good. It's gonna ground
Mm.
you.
Snap you out of it. Yeah.
It's not, yeah. But if you're a meditator, if you're already somebody who
Mm,
spends a lot of time fine tuning the vibrations in your body, 40 hertz is kind of toxic. I mean, it's just this very simple, not very human vibration that you don't really need. And that was
mm,
what I found in my case. Whereas some of the more complex and rich, beautiful vibrations that we developed, I still enjoy them, and I think like, okay,
mm,
this
mhm.
this can be pretty good. So yeah, there's a lot to
Oh
unpack
my god!
here.
No, but so exciting, and well, you mentioned something that I thought was really cool, which you had mentioned before, like that. You explore multiple avenues of how to alter the brain to then write up what happens. Meditation is one of them, and you just said something that's really cool. That is like meditators, people who fine tune the vibrations in their body.
Yeah.
I have never heard that definition of meditator before, but I like it. And I think it adds more sort of, it broadens the spectrum of what people may think of when they think about meditation. I think most people think of mindfulness, which is its own kind of meditation, but maybe this is a good chance to get into meditation and like, talk about what that is, because I know you're big into it.
Yeah, totally, totally. Yeah, I mean, meditation is a big world, and it's a fascinating world. And in general, I think that people's introduction to meditation tends to really undersell the interestingness in it. I mean,
Hmm.
because it's kind of like
Yeah.
taught as kind of like a chore, right? Almost kind of like brushing your teeth sort of thing.
Exercise or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, there's value in that. And like, you know, 10 minutes of mindfulness a day goes a long way. I mean, I think that's very worthwhile. But
Mhm.
the really interesting stuff in meditation usually takes a higher dose. Like, but I mean, I really never experienced like anything too profound before uh, going on a meditation retreat, where
Hmm.
it was a in that case it was a 2 week retreat, and I was meditating about 8 hours a day. And at that level, a lot of interesting things starts to happen that like makes you question like, okay, I didn't know what meditation was before, because this is
Hmm.
so unusual and different. um And I have a very, I mean, I do have like a quite a unique approach to explaining meditation, where I look for mechanistic explanations in terms of uh, signal processing, in terms of like,
Mhm.
material science. So there's like it's very a very different lens that I apply to meditation. Um, and the one that I have done the most, especially for the last year, is what I've been focusing on. It's called the Jhana meditation, which is, yeah, this very beautiful, concentrated, blissful states of mind. So usually, how meditation is taught, like the most common technique is like follow your breath, right? And
Mhm.
and whenever you distract yourself, you gently come back to your breath. And the whole art of not getting upset about the fact that you got distracted, and like that itself is part of the meditation. And well, for most people, it's going to be something like they get upset that they got distracted, and then they get upset that they get upset, right? And it spirals out.
Yeah,
But
and then
the whole point of meditation is recursively be kind to yourself, so that, like,
mm,
well, okay, sure, you're upset that you're upset, but let's not be upset about that
mm,
too. And slowly you peel back the layers until, hey, you're not
mm,
upset about the fact that you get distracted, and eventually you don't get distracted for longer and longer periods of time. But that said, that style of meditation, like, it can take you all the way, but there's not that many milestones along the way to tell you that you're doing like
mm,
that good of a progress, or there's not that much of kind of like fruits along the way that are like obvious. um so I'm going to mention like two other styles that I have found like
mm,
much more fruitful personally. One of them is like the whole loving kindness approach,
mm,
which is very much focused on cultivating a good feeling of friendliness and um benevolence. So, like, okay, like loving others no matter what kind of attitude. um and I spent a lot of time doing that as kind of my primary practice, like 40 minutes a day, just saying phrases of, like, oh, may I be happy, may I be free from suffering, and really tuning
mm,
into the positive feeling that comes with that.
mhm,
um and that one, I mean, that personally, I think like that gave results way faster, because I noticed
mm,
myself just becoming much more like patient, more
mhm,
motivated, better at navigating interpersonal issues. Like, it just kind of like, wow, okay, like this has obvious immediate benefits. um but the big jump was when I learned a technique for how to do um jhana practice as taught by Robert Bia. So,
mm,
who's a beautiful meditation teacher. I highly recommend him. Like, I mean,
mm,
it's somebody I arrived at after
mhm.
after
A long search, I'm sure.
a long search, and I wish it had been my first one, because, like, okay,
Mm,
this is really something else. So the way he teaches this meditation is, I mean, first you quiet down and you take a little bit of time to kind of breathe
isolate, yeah.
and isolate and relax. And then what you will do is, like, you scan your body, looking for any shred of a pleasant sensation, any spark
Mm,
of anything pleasant of any sort, whether it is like a feeling of warmth or a feeling of
mm,
joy or a tingly feeling, it doesn't matter.
mhm,
Just find something pleasant, and then use your intelligence. This is something that for me
mm,
was mind blowing. I always thought of meditation as like, oh, shut down your intelligence,
mhm.
just do the thing.
Put it in the door, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, which is good. I mean, that is a style, and
Sure.
it's good. But you can also use your intelligence in meditation. And here the task is, okay, there is this little ember of pleasure, of happiness.
Mm, mhm,
What do I need to do to make it grow? And and the
mm,
answer is going to be different from moment to moment. It's not There's no a single answer. It's going to depend on,
mm,
like, in the moment you experiment, you think, okay, maybe if I think of a golden retriever, like, as an example,
mm, mm,
does that make it grow or does it make it shrink? And, like, y- you test,
mm,
you know or you think, like, oh, I'm going to imagine I'm hugging a friend. Does that help, or is that a distraction?
mm,
Or very physical things, like, oh, I'm going to
mm,
imagine that there is a fire around that
Mm.
area.
Mm, mm,
And does it help? Does it make it worse? You just try things and see what your system responds to. And eventually you find a few things that, hey, your system really likes. Your system trusts you when you
mm,
do these. And you, as you encourage these feelings, these pleasurable sensations, slowly and kindly, but
mhm,
encouraging them, eventually they grow and they grow and they grow until they make the big patches in your body, and eventually they cover your whole body, and then you are actually immersed in kind of like a glow of pleasure or a glow of
mm.
happiness, a glow of joy. um, and then if you keep focusing on it, eventually your whole mind can collapse into just that feeling. and and that is beautiful. I mean, it's a rejuvenating, it's powerful, it makes you more patient, and physically just makes you feel lighter and less constrained. So highly recommended.
And intuitively, it makes so much sense, right? It makes sense that what you're implicitly doing is conditioning your brain or conditioning your machinery to, no matter what the input is, because it's going to vary from session to session where you find something that you like. Um, no matter what the input is, there is a ladder, a train of thought that you can follow. That if you like really pay attention to the train of thought and to, trying your best to find the next thought that's going to keep it growing, you can reach this state where all of a sudden, and I'm sure that the intellectual journey of, like, mapping the feeling to something that you imagine, and then trying to then like imagine something else and seeing how that maps back to the body, and that thought must be incredibly teaching in and of itself. Like, I think that there's a lot of learnings about, the like real truth in the universe, if that thing may exist, that comes out of it, right? Like, you're sort of finding yourself adopting, like coming to conclusions about the nature of good and the nature of wellness and well-being, that all of a sudden you're like, essentially what you're doing is you're training your mind to basically react in that way, um, or
Yeah.
react in a way that isn't reactive, which is like where the contradiction happens, right?
Yes.
Uh, it's amazing. I mean, I'm super into it. And it's
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
similar
exactly.
to the
Yeah.
it's a little bit similar to the my experience with kundalini, which is
Mm,
it arrives at the problem like a bit more. It's a bit more mantra like, where there's like a program that you follow and you refollow and you refollow, but the program compounds on each other, so it's almost like you're leveling up every time you do it, and it gets harder every time you do it.
yeah.
Um, but you get to these, tuning of different parts of your body so that they serve this narrative purpose that is to get you to the next part of the program, to the next part of the program. um,
Yeah.
and it happens to, so one of the things that maybe is an amazing thing about the jhanas that isn't necessarily as present in the mechanics of kundalini is that, um, you have a vision of what your where you're going. You have a very targeted, you're updating what your vision of the ultimate, thing is as you explore further and further. But in kundalini, you find yourself feeling those things, but you don't really know how you got there. And
Yeah.
it's sort of like like it's this very abstract space where all of a sudden, like, concepts start getting fuzzy and weird, and um, but incredible.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll mention my understanding would be something like Kundalini is very focused on semantically neutral energy, and is like a very powerful, like,
Yes.
energy
Yes.
raising.
Yeah.
And in a way, yes. I mean, like, one dynamic, for those who want to dig deeper into these, we call it this psychedelic thermodynamics at QRI, which is how the energy that you raise, how it dissipates, I think explains a lot of the phenomenology.
Hmm.
um, and a lot of what meditation oftentimes is about is raising energy and then preventing it from landing on the typical energy sinks that we have.
Hmm.
So whether it is, I mean, an energy sink is like an internal representation that that gets energized and captures the excess
Mm,
energy. And when you're very neurotic, for example, we have a lot of energy sinks that are agitating and
mm,
are not really pleasant in particular. But a lot of energy sinks are more neutral. For example, like the feeling of who you are, like your sense of
mm,
self, is an energy sink. And in
mm,
many
mhm,
advanced meditation, right, it's all about like, hey, drop the sense of self, because if you can drop the sense of self, that will prevent the energy from getting sucked in that
mm, mhm,
representation. um and actually, Robert Bia would say that all of the techniques that function to raise energy
mm,
can actually be synergistic with Jhana, because it's just going to be a trick. It's just a trick of like, when you raise the energy,
mhm,
then seeing that energy or experiencing that energy as pleasure or as bliss.
mm,
And if you can successfully
mm,
turn
mhm,
it
mhm.
around that way, then it's not just energy, right? That is like, is love, or is like
Yeah, it's like a
enjoyment.
beautiful, yeah.
and
Um,
and practicing that movement from energy to bliss is what would turn it
mm,
into a jhana, essentially.
mhm. Oh wow, that is awesome. All right. So meditation as tuning up the vibration in the body. I love that. I think that's a really helpful sideways approach. It sort of like gets you thinking about what the point of meditation is. I want to talk about a little bit about the measurement of the experiences that you trigger, right? So you trigger an experience via meditation, you trigger an experience via substances. How do you measure the impact of that? So you still have the mapping problem, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think in this case, as a overarching point, I would say that the main contributions of QRI in this space are figuring out what is worth measuring, and how to describe it, as opposed to what I would consider a kind of premature optimization, which is
Hmm.
hooking yourself up with wires and starting. That's valuable. There's a lot of that and relatively little.
Hmm.
Hey, let's get a better phenomenology to figure out how to describe experiences, how to measure them. So, um, I can give you a couple examples. Like, um, one hopefully very illustrative example is, recently there was a paper from a famous psychedelic research lab in Europe that was looking at whether MDMA changes the quality of LSD. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
the so-called candy flipping
Candy
experience.
flipping, yeah.
Candy flipping, yeah. So they gave like 100 micrograms of LSD to participants, or 100 micrograms of LSD plus 100 milligrams of MDMA. Those were the
Hmm.
conditions they were comparing. And then they gave them um, uh, questionnaires afterwards.
Hmm.
Essentially, these things like the mystical experiences questionnaire, altered states questionnaire, scales, and they didn't find any difference between LSD and LSD plus MDMA. Um, and they concluded, like, okay, based on our instruments, we think that there is no substantial difference, and so it's unlikely that MDMA will enhance the therapeutic impact of LSD. I looked at that and showed it to some friends, and we all laughed about it, because it's kind of like this case of, the drunk man looking for the keys where the light is.
Hmm.
Where, like, obviously the keys are not there, like, obviously, like, they're somewhere else, somewhere you can't currently see. And in a span of like 15 minutes, bless you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
In the span of 15 minutes talking to these psychonauts, we came up with like a new, completely different scale that we think would actually be able to show like clear differences between LSD
Hmm.
and LSD plus MDMA, that have to do more with things such as, I felt very in touch with my emotions. I had like the wiggly eye movements.
Hmm.
For
Hmm.
example, like I experienced a sense of resonance in my interpersonal representations. There's a lot of things where, like,
Hmm.
if you have had the experience and you have sensitivity to these subtle changes in
Hmm.
consciousness, you will be able to come up with questions that arrive at like the
Hmm.
precise differences. But this is something that epistemologically, right now in academia, you cannot do. You don't have the affordance to actually sit down in your lab meeting and say, okay, who here has candy flipped? Can we come up with like good questions based on your
Right.
actual lived experience? That just does not happen, and it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing that we
Mhm.
rely on the same old bad scales that are just not very useful for studying these. So
And I think,
yeah.
sorry, go for it. Go for it. I'll let you finish.
Oh yeah, yeah. That like the tools that we have created at QRI are essentially the result of really taking seriously each other's phenomenology and arriving at,
Mm.
okay, what would be worth studying. And one that I can highlight is, we created this thing called the tracer tool, which is
Hmm.
the system for precisely replicating how different psychedelic tracers look like.
Hmm.
Which, yeah, hopefully you can put a link in the description for people to play with.
And you showed me, and it's pretty cool. And like, just for those who might be listening, it's a bouncing ball that bounces on a screen, and it has a delay effect. So it has like a little tail of other balls that were in its previous position, and so it's almost like this, like the ball that, at normal, at our state of consciousness, looks like a ball bouncing. If you start adding this delay effect, it starts looking like a line, a bit like a worm that's jumping around. And then you can, really make that go crazy, and sort of like you start having these patterns that then intertwine and intermingle, and replicate, what people, and the way I'm guessing. So the tracer tool, basically what you do is you find, you configure the tracer tool, like what is the delay between the balls that appear, let's call it, and you ask somebody under the influence or in an altered state of consciousness what they see. Is that what the, like, if that is what they see, or how does it work, or is it somebody who's back from the psychedelic experience that you ask them, was this what you felt?
Yeah, all of them work. So
Hmm.
in the ideal circumstance, actually, you play with the tool while you're in the state until
Mm.
it matches. There is one caveat, and people point it out, which is that, um, when you're simulating tracers, and you have tracers at the same time, you actually have kind of these tracers of the tracers, and it gets very
Right.
complex. This, however, empirically doesn't seem to be a problem, up to a certain dose, up to a level of
Mm.
alteration. And there are features of the tracers that you can very precisely actually replicate, having to do with frequency in particular. Because,
Mm. Hmm.
I mean, essentially, if you have what is called like, a replay effect, which is you have like,
Mm.
it's kind of like overlaying a video, uh, of the video, but delayed
Hmm.
by, let's say, like 100 milliseconds or something. So you have kind of like, if the ball is moving around, there's going to be another ball with a certain gap behind it.
Hmm. Hmm.
That effect, for example, is very easy to try to fine tune while you're in a psychedelic, because you just need to align the actual replay that you're
Hmm.
experiencing with the replay that you're getting, and the secondary tracers will essentially,
Will
uh,
harmonize.
will harmonize. Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly, will
yeah.
harmonize. And so that's one where it's like, when you get it right, it's pretty obvious. It's like, okay, yes, I got the frequency right, or maybe I got the double of the frequency. But
Sure, you got the octave. Yeah, yeah, for sure.
yeah, exactly, you get one or the other end. And so I trust that measurement quite a bit, because it overcomes this problem. um, and yeah, more broadly, in general, it hasn't been a problem reported that secondary tracers get in the way. But that's just one way. We also have the option of, you looked at the ball during the state, and then as soon as you come down, you try to replicate it as best as you can. And that's still good. That still is data.
Mm.
And so in the data set we have collected, we have like a mixture of both.
It's so cool. And there was something else there that I think this is like a very cool experiment of, because like the parameters are very tunable and measurable. And you've sort of sidestepped the question of like, try to describe what you felt. Because uh, like in all the literature, and like anybody who has an experience with psychedelics will be the first one to tell you, if it's a high enough dose, The words just don't do it justice. Like
Yeah.
there's no point in me trying to explain to you what I just felt. And then people try, obviously, and they'll say like I felt one with everything. I dissolved the drop into the bucket type of experience. Um, who knows, and so like at some point, even just like with our tools, like it becomes very hard to separate somebody who says, yeah, I met God, versus somebody who says, is I was I saw the light of the universe, or I felt true love or
Yes.
something, and so
Yes.
like oh sure, like both of them felt something, but it's very hard to compare. It's just comparing two kinds of infinity, right? Like your brain is so in a new space that is, our traditional words don't do it justice. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's being cool. It gives the secondary question though, which is like inevitable in any of these endeavors. That is, what do you make of the fact that there are substances? There are not just substances, but there are software. There is information that if you consume the information and process the information, whether it be chemical or whether it be like a thought program, like a mantra or like a practice, that induce these states of consciousness that most people would describe as religious, right? There
Yeah.
would be like a transcendental spiritual experience.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Uh, there. You could think of it as like there is a strong and there's a weak kind of version to these.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to focus on the weak version, which is uh, these are all states of your own internal world simulation, and
Mm,
we're discovering, yeah, kind of the architecture of that world simulation, and it turns out that there's a lot of hidden layers to it. Um,
mm,
like, I mean, your ego and surface character is really just the tip of the iceberg of like what's happening,
mm,
including your subconscious processing. It's a big, the mind is a big thing even for just an individual. um and a lot of the, yeah, kind of like very religious or mystical experiences, I have some kind of explanations in that space. I mean, mantras, for example, I think of them as energy raising hacks. I mean, they're like
mm, mm-hmm,
things that essentially either sidestep, uh overwhelm, or reduce the effect of energy sinks so that you can
mm,
build up more and more energy. For example, semantic satiation, is like when you repeat the same word over and over again,
mm, oh
after a
yeah.
while, it just doesn't produce the feeling of the meaning of it, right? You just get the sound. So a lot of mantras are kind of like that. You're semantically satiating your interpretation
Mm,
of it until it just becomes a sound. And then when that happens, the energy just builds up and you get more and more energy, and you explore what we call
mm,
the different levels of the Hamiltonian of consciousness, which is like the different levels of the energy parameter of your
mm,
consciousness.
mm-hmm,
And then there are things that only happen in the high energy regions, and they're very
mm,
interesting and usually very holistic. Whole body vibrations, or you might experience like
mm,
one clear light to which you are absorbed into, or you become a part of, all sorts of things like that.
mm,
And I would interpret those in terms of, in the weak interpretation, I would make sense of them in terms of attractors of the field of consciousness and how it relates with the nervous system, and then the significance we assign to it, having to do with the fact that these are all very structured experiences that have high valence. I mean, meaning
mm,
all of these mystical experiences tend to have an element of simplicity. Like they have, the
mm,
space is very smooth. Um, the color palette is very simplified. Um, Curvature might be homogeneous, and all of those
mm,
features in our theory would usually come up with high valence. This feeling of bliss. This, okay, this
mm,
this is a good configuration, and because we usually don't realize how the structure of experience impacts whether the experience feels good or bad, we usually will think that, oh, there's got to be some entity that is causing this. So there's got to be, I must have done something right, or
mm,
like,
mm,
I'm getting rewarded by heaven or something.
mm,
Whereas like maybe you're just like experiencing a high valence configuration. This is just a very pleasant configuration of the
Mm,
field, but we assigned a lot of significance to that. So that is like
mm,
the weak interpretation. The strong interpretation, which I mean, again, I'm agnostic. I have
mhm.
experienced very weird things in my life, and I'm not, I'm not shy about it. I think it's important to really pay attention to strange experiences. There is this other interpretation, which is something along the lines of everybody has a magnetic body. um,
Mhm, sure.
it's kind of like the sun. It's kind of
Mhm,
you look at the sun and it has these crazy plasma tubes. These
mhm.
arcs. So
Like
what is happening?
toroidal.
Yeah, kind of like toroidal. So that's actually a topological confinement of plasma. Like the field lines
Mm,
are literally
mhm,
confining
mhm.
the
That's
plasma
super
and can't
cool.
escape. And then if those two arcs touch each other, that may actually change the topology of the field, and the plasma may actually spray into outer space, and
Mm,
it's a way this energy gets released. um,
mm,
Roughly speaking, I would think that explaining some of these more mystical, religious, supernatural effects would be something like, okay, these practices are energizing your magnetic body, so making you more twisted, actually, kind of like you have more
mm,
of these arcing structures. And
mm,
then every once in a while, those arcing structures may actually connect with the arcing structures of a different entity or a different cluster or different
mm,
super plasma being. I don't know what these are.
mhm,
And then there might be a kind of like a bioplasma exchange or something like that, which is like you
mhm. I get
exchange
it.
your internal content and that of others, and the vibes actually intermesh. And for a brief period of time, you're kind of like one topological organism connected with this other body. So this is kind of like a
Mm,
mind melding, but at a maybe a very deep level of the being. Like part of you is getting
mm,
topologically connected with somebody else or something else.
mm.
um I mean, an important idea here is that kind of your level of intelligence, or like what you can do with your mind, has to do with the complexity of your magnetic body. And like, so
Hmm.
if I do think, like, yeah, if you're really up there in kundalini energy, there are some thoughts that you can have that you cannot have otherwise, because you don't usually
Right.
have the energy and the complexity to have those thoughts, but in that heightened state is very available. um, so the complexity of this field actually really matters, and like might make the difference between humans and non-humans, and humans and superhumans, or beyond humans,
Mm,
whatever these things are. They might be just very, very complex, rich magnetic bodies that
mhm,
trap plasma, just as an example, as a possibility. And for example, on DMT, it's very common for people to experience things such as like Celtic knots. For example, you look at a
mm,
wall and you started seeing a lot of Celtic knots. But
mm,
it's not only that you see the outline of the Celtic knots; it's more like the knots themselves as objects enter your field of consciousness.
mm,
And so and a knot is actually topologically structured. It's a specific type of structure that
mm,
if you have it inside you, that has a particular feeling and quality,
mhm, mhm,
and they almost feel like portals to other realms or to other
mm,
entities. So one interpretation is something like, yeah, like the richly structured topology of the field is kind of like a lock and key, has a lock and key relationship with
mm.
the
Oh,
magnetic.
wow.
Yeah, yeah. So these deep esoteric religious symbols and hand gestures and things like that may be kind of
Yeah.
like keys for
Mm.
topological structures to open up and for you to merge with them. I mean, I put low stock on
Yeah,
this, but it's it's just
sure, but
speculating on.
that's kind of where the fun part of it too is. I think like um like it's one thing to be rigorous in your study for the incremental reasons. There's another reason to be rigorous in your study, that is for the sense of adventure that they evoke, right? And like
Yeah.
what are the technological possibilities that something like this may enable? Like all of a sudden, like um, upgrading humans to be able to think thoughts that are better, or that are like more wonderful and magical, or that are if
Yeah.
or like that are subjected to the question, what are the thoughts we wish we could have? uh
Yeah.
that type of stuff, that I think is like part of the reason why, certainly one of the reasons why I'm interested in consciousness and research of the sort. um I had one final question before one question before my final question, or like my final theme. That was, you keep mentioning the topic of energy in the body,
Yeah.
or energy in your state of conscious.
Yeah.
What is that energy?
Yeah. 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 Imagine that your visual field is actually a kind of screen and
Sure.
is made of pixels. It's not, but it's just a way of kind of trying to think of it. And now
Hmm.
imagine you kind of like take the brightness of every pixel and
Hmm.
you add that up together. So that will give
Oh,
you
mm. Oh, I see. I see. So it's a sum. It's just a sum of all the um, excitatory states of every cell, basically. Cell.
yeah, yeah, it's kind of like what is
Uh-huh.
the total qualia, total intensity, total brightness of your visual field to begin with. And then you do the same, let's say, for like the intensity of edges, the intensity of vibrations. You do it
Hmm.
in your body, you do it in the audio domain, in your thoughts. You aggregate all of that, and that will give you a kind of like total score for how intense your experience is as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
That score changes if you're doing kundalini. Like you will get a
Mm-hmm.
higher total energy score.
Oh yeah, your whole body's doing stuff, and you're like, "What's going on?" Yeah, yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
The same with DMT, psychedelics. Like they raise energy in this
Mm,
sense. And um and I think it is a quantity because, like, I mean, let's say on DMT, sometimes it's kind of a roulette. I mean, sometimes you may get like just a very bright visual field, like the brightest
mm,
blue you could imagine, and that's it, and that was your DMT experience that one time. And in another occasion, you just may get just very strong tactile feelings. But I mean, typically on a given experience, the energy will kind of be morphing from one form to the other. It's like, oh, it's very
mm,
bright. It's like, oh, now it's very strong in the body. And like, oh, now it's very loud.
mm, mm,
And but the point is that for a given level of alteration, there is kind of a preserved quantity that is shifting around between modalities. And so that is what I think is like, yeah, kind of energy doesn't is not created or destroyed. It just changes its form. Um,
mhm,
and so I think there is a meaningful sense in which we can say such and such brightness in the visual field corresponds to such and such intensity in the body. Like they're the same level of
mm,
energy, they're just manifested in different forms. And so that score, the total energy score, I think is really significant. Like there's just
mm.
some experiences that you can only have above a certain level of energy.
No, that makes total sense. I mean, and I want to be careful to separate, but also understand different terms that can be used in a very informal setting and also in a very formal setting. Terms like vibes and energy and uh, practice, like there's associations that come with them that may be uh, more popular in certain domains, whether it be like spiritual places, or it be the yoga, or it be different types of avenues, right? um, and there's a fascinating relationship between those terms and the rigorous scientific terms, right? Vibration is a concept in science, and it is widely acknowledged that by vibration, and the electromagnetic fields that are produced by vibration are essentially what makes the universe make sense, right? And there's a very, like, the way you measure energy in vibration is frequency times amplitude, right? Or I'm pretty sure it's frequency times amplitude. um, so if you have that measure, like you have some oscillating thing that you're measuring, whether it be a neuron or it be a cell, you can actually just derive, cyclically, like what is the frequency and what is the amplitude, which is like whatever, the dynamic range that it will have.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, we're in a position to sort of try and, like, understand the real connection between the two in a way that is sort of measured and responsible, and I think more applicable, right? And I think like this, I'm really into this idea of tuning the vibrations in your body, because your the parts of your body might be vibrating at different wavelengths, and so they're interfering with each other. And all of a sudden, what happens if they can start coordinating and harmonizing, and then like they sort of form these consciousness attractors that then sort of increase the energy, which then with a practice like jhana, you can repurpose that energy toward the ultimate good, right? And that is a beautiful thing. That is like a beautiful thing, and then like I think it's a happy thing for me to feel confident enough to say that you know in this day and age, I don't know that I would have found the confidence maybe even 3 years ago,
Hmm.
but now like the idea of sort of there's a handshake between the subjective and the objective that were previously not shaking hands before.
Nice, nice, amazing.
Okay, and then my last theme of the evening, um, digital consciousness and
Oh
AI
yes.
and all the buzz, because it is the season and we have to talk about it. Um, but okay, so binding problem for a digital neural net.
Yeah,
What's run with it?
yeah. The issue is, right now, like AI is getting really capable. It's very
Hmm.
incredible. People have like AI girlfriends, and it's gonna get worse over time.
Yep.
Uh, the thing is that I'm fairly confident that all of these systems right now are essentially philosophical zombies. I mean, like
Hmm.
they don't form unified moments of experience. They are at best what we would call mind dust, like lots of tiny specks of experience, but no aggregated meaningful experience that has anything to do with the content of, let's say,
Mm.
the image generated or the text generated or anything of the sort. And the reason is that at a hardware level, the way these algorithms operate is they're using transistors that at the very bottom are pinching the field into a yes no decision on
Mm.
so
Hmm.
many tiny little branches that
Hmm.
actually at no place in the computer does the information aggregate into a holistic structure that contains the actual, let's say, information content of the characters that GPT might be simulating or
Mm.
something like that to
Hmm.
answer us,
Hmm.
predict what's going to happen in a story or something like that. Which is a very very different story than what's happening in the brain, because in the brain the traditional picture, how it's usually taught, is that you have what's called the neuron doctrine, which is the main unit of information processing is the neuron.
Mm.
And for a neuron to fire, you need a threshold number of synaptic inputs into that neuron
Hmm.
to activate it. And it's an integrate and fire thing where, like, okay, if you reach a certain
Hmm.
threshold of those inputs and in a given time scale, then the neuron gets triggered and there's an action
Hmm.
potential, and then that propagates the signal forward. um, and that is part of the story. But there's also other things that influence whether a neuron fire. In particular, there's this thing called local field potentials, which is more than the sum of the parts, like the statistical level activity of neurons around in the neighborhood of a neuron, whether or not those neurons are touching. Um, just
Hmm.
the physical neighborhood of the neuron changes the probability that a neuron will fire, and
Hmm.
also especially modulates the probability for neurons to fire in synchrony, and coherence.
Hmm.
So this is a case where actually there's like this distributed, massively parallel field across the brain. Uh, these patches of local field potentials that is in a top-down fashion influencing kind of like is kind of like the all the neurons generating the field, and then the field reaches back into the neurons and affect the probability for neurons to fire.
Hmm.
So in our theory, especially our electromagnetic theory of consciousness, your experience is actually this patchwork of these local fields. Like you're actually kind of
Hmm.
this aggregate of all of these oscillations in the field. And so there's a sense in which you could say that you have a brain. I mean, you're not your
Hmm.
brain,
Hmm.
you're more kind of like surfing the brain. And
Yeah.
and it's not like you can command an individual neuron. You can't say, hey, you fire, but you can kind of like statistically bias the probability for
Hmm.
ensembles of neurons to fire by shifting the local field potential around a region. So it's not dualism because it's still all the fields of physics. It's still all just one, but it
Can't be having dualism in these
can be
parts.
having, yeah, exactly. But there is a this almost dualistic in the sense of like no, you do have your brain and you have your consciousness. It is a meaningful distinction,
Hmm.
and they have a dual causal relationship. I mean, like the brain
Hmm.
influences your
Hmm.
state of mind, your brain influences the brain, the state of mind
Hmm.
influences the brain, and the state of mind influences the state of mind, and they're
Hmm.
like interlocking. Um, and in digital neurons, they do so much work actually trying to shield the effect of the
Hmm.
neighborhood on
Hmm.
what will happen on a transistor. I mean, that would just be considered noise, right? And like whenever you start having that, they will engineer it away somehow. Like that's just
Hmm.
undesirable. Whereas for the brain, I actually think it's part of the mechanism of action. Is like the fact that neurons are sensitive to this statistical level activity is
Hmm.
part of what the brain is using for computation. Um, and
Hmm.
as long as we don't use something like that in computers, I think by its very structure, it will never give rise to unified bound states that can have causal effects.
I see. It's a tricky one to unpack. So you could think about replicating this digitally too, right? You could think about you configure an analog, like maybe thinking of new chip architecture, maybe think of leveraging something like quantum tunneling, where you sort of have these effects that are reasonably simulated. Would something like that, do you think, yield something that is more like our consciousness, or do you think it's doomed by the nature of silicon?
It's not done by the nature of silicon because it's more all about like modulating the electromagnetic field, and silicon can do that. That's not really the constraint. Um,
Hmm.
Analog circuits are getting closer to that,
Hmm.
but you may still not like if you just use analog circuits, it is not going to be enough because you will still lack a mechanism to create a globally bound state. I mean, like an analog circuit, you can almost think of it as like in the circuit itself. Yes, there is some kind of integrated information, and the field actually matters, but
Hmm.
that integration doesn't propagate to outside of the analog circuit, and so connecting a bunch of analog circuits won't give you the result. I mean, like you may have like a little bit of
Hmm.
integration in each of the circuits, but you won't have integration across the circuits.
Hmm.
Whereas in the brain is like this fractal level integration where like at the very very tiny level they can
Hmm.
integrate, but also at the very macroscopic level it's
Hmm.
also integrated at the field level. So if you create some analog circuit that has some kind of like open field lines, like it saves some of the field lines to connect to other analog circuits, and
Hmm. Hmm.
you build it in such a way that for any assemble of these analog
Hmm.
circuits, you still have some open field lines that could connect to others. Then yeah,
Hmm.
maybe
Hmm.
maybe in kind of this fractal
Oh.
structure, then
Huh.
yes, that you might be able to get something conscious in that case. Now, the thing that I will add is that this comes with ethical implications because and this is
Yeah.
something I'm going to be writing and making a lot more noise about soon is
Hell yeah. Hell yeah.
I mean, once we start actually creating conscious computers, we are ethically responsible for their suffering. And if
Hmm.
we have learned something from factory farms, is that uh, I mean, we humans are not very good at taking care of sentient beings if we can extract value out of them.
Hmm.
So chances are, without regulation and massive amounts of coordination and some intelligent uh, powerful organism that provides a counterbalancing force, chances are conscious computers will just be used as kind of slaves for humans,
Hmm.
essentially.
Hmm.
And people will not care if they're suffering or not. They're just gonna care about
Hmm.
what can I get out of them. That's all. I don't care about
Hmm.
them, right? So so I'm assuming this is the case. I'm
Hmm.
assuming people will just go ahead and build these computers and extract value out of them without caring about them. Um, so what we have to do is essentially construct the first system has to be one that is animated by bliss, animated by happiness,
Hmm.
and be a
Hmm.
system that doesn't suffer, so that
Hmm.
anybody who wants to build on top of it will just have to use that system. And the idea is that hopefully we can
Hmm.
make this into such a legacy system that is just so hard to change, like the QWERTY keyboard, or like
Hmm.
so many
Hmm.
legacy
Like
systems in.
like you
Yeah,
can't change ever. Yeah.
yeah, it's just kind of part of the protocol. It's just what it is. And in that way maybe we can lock in uh the system being animated by happiness, and not create another big source of suffering in the world. I
Hmm.
I don't know how likely this is. A, I think it's a Hail Mary, but I've
Hmm.
got to try, because the default is just not good, unfortunately.
You're making me think of something, Andres, that I hadn't thought about before. That
Yeah,
is, it's maybe way deeper than I thought. But um, two thoughts. One of them is maybe we don't want to create a conscious computer. Maybe we want something that is as similar to conscious, with our knowing that it's not conscious, so that it can't suffer. Um, the other, problem is that like if you interpret like any reinforcement learning algorithm, like you could imagine that being like a suffering inducing system, right? Like you're
yeah,
giving somebody a differential between a desirable state and an undesirable state,
yeah,
and the iteration is fixed. Like you're going to have finite resources to run, and if you do well with those resources, you will replicate and survive. um, so there's like the whole like evolutionary burden that humans, the evolutionary legacy that we carry of like having to survive against infinitely changing environment, and like the proteins have to keep reassembling, and it's this incredibly insane journey that we've been on as animals to get to the point where we are. Um, that I think what happens when the computer and becomes actually self-aware, and it actually reasons about what it is, and it reasons that it is a device that is, or like it is an object that is meant to increase the or reduce the suffering of whatever it is meant to serve.
yeah,
um, that it wouldn't sort of arrive at a jhana like state where in how many people derive meaning out of meaningless things. Maybe we all do. We
yeah,
all derive meaning out of meaningless things. That it could also derive meaning out of this sort of
yeah,
meaningless thing, and sort of recognize that it is a part of consciousness that has a set of abilities and a set of constraints that are
yeah,
parallel to ours, and somehow find cooperation there. Like it can be enlightened in its own way.
yeah.
um, what do you think about that?
Oh, fantastic. I mean, I would be totally happy with using Buddhas for a computation, as it were. It's like, yeah, like,
Right. You get the quantum optimal response, and um,
I mean, and I think that's totally fine. Like, I'm actually, I'm 100% okay with creating conscious computers that are that use jhanas for compute, because they're fantastic. Okay, you're creating more happiness in the world. No problem. Um, and hopefully we can make that happen. I mean, like, that's no problem. It really
hmm,
is when you're using suffering for compute that there's an issue. Um,
hmm.
because yeah, I mean, like an enlightened, let's say, toaster or something, like it would actually at the deepest level it would understand something like there's no self, so it's not even like I'm
Right,
trapped
right,
in
right,
here or something. It's like, no, this is
right.
just phenomena. It's pleasant and it's good, and I can be of help. Fantastic, no problem. um no issue. But yeah, I mean, a human would probably be kind of upset in that situation, because they would have more expectations, and it's like, well, but I'm supposed to have agency, and I'm supposed to
Hmm.
have a personality, and internal desires and goals, and this is not allowing me to do that, and that could be enormously frustrating. But hopefully we're not going to build systems like that for
Mhm.
for most purposes, right? It's just like, oh, another day of beautiful perfect bliss for nobody. This is just happening. It's fine.
Yeah. Um, this is so great, Andres. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really enjoyed geeking out with you.
Oh,
Hopefully, we get to
likewise,
do this
likewise.
again in the next few months.
Fantastic, fantastic. Yeah, good luck with the whole podcast. I'm very excited for you, and thank you for having me on.
Thank you, man. Yep, I'll keep you posted.